Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal, and the next section of line 5 that we're going to tackle deals with failed abortions. That's an abortion where the baby survived. And the first of those cases, it cited a Philadelphia Inquirer story, and so when I went searching for that, I found the entire dreaded complication special that they did. And I really recommend that you follow the link below. I'm doing a 2-part series about the dreaded complication. Did you notice a dreaded complication is not a dead woman, it's a live baby. So I'm just going to go through in 2 parts, one today and one tomorrow, highlighting what the Philadelphia Inquirer found. And then we will tackle the failed abortions from line 5 on the 3rd day. So we can start with a baby boy in Omaha in 1979. A woman's scream broke the late night quiet and brought 2 young obstetrical nurses rushing to room 4456 of the University of Nebraska Medical Center. The patient was there for a saline abortion. When nurse Marilyn Wilson flicked on the lights and pulled back the covers, she found, instead of the stillborn fetus she'd expected, a live 2.5-pound baby boy crying and moving his arms and legs there on the bed. So a second nurse snatched the baby up in some of the bed covers and ran down the hall, calling for other nurses for help. Quote, "She did not take the baby to an intensive care nursery, but deposited it instead on the stainless steel drain board of a sink in the maternity unit's dirty utility room, a large closet where bedpans are emptied and dirty linen stored. Finally, a head nurse telephoned the patient's physician, Dr. C.J. Lebenz, at home, apparently waking him. He told me to leave it where it was," the head nurse testified later. "Just watch it for a few minutes, that it would probably die in a few minutes." The neglected little girl took 2.5 hours to die, 1 hour for every pound that that baby weighed. Then there was the case of a baby girl in Florida who was found lying in a bedpan. She was aborted alive around 1976. As of the time the story was written, she was 5 years old and doing well. So after that introduction of 2 cases, one where the baby died and one where the baby lived, brought up the case of how often does this happen. And the authors postulated that for every case that does become known, 100 probably go unreported. They noted that Dr. Willard Cates of the CDC estimated 400 to 500 babies surviving abortions annually in the United States. They are little known, the article said, because organized medicine, from fear of public clamor and legal action, treats them more as an embarrassment to be hushed up than a problem to be solved. It's like turning yourself into the IRS for an audit, Kate said. What is there to gain? The tendency is not to report because there are only negative incentives. So we look at staff reactions. The authors noted that many facilities didn't have protocols for dealing with live births from abortions, and even if they were there, staff might not follow them. Typically, the births would take place when the doctor in charge of the abortion wasn't present, leaving nurses or other staff to take charge. So babies aren't assessed after abortions, but merely presumed dead unless they make obvious movements or sounds, and even then the medical professional on the scene may just let the baby die rather than try to save it. The article goes on to note that such live births are taking a heavy emotional toll on medical staffs across the country. Some physicians say that they have burned out and stopped doing abortions altogether. Nursing staffs at hospitals in Cleveland, Grand Rapids, Fort Lauderdale, and elsewhere have rebelled at late abortions and have stopped their hospitals from performing any abortions later than the midpoint of pregnancy. Some staff members who regularly perform late abortions report having nightmares about fetuses, including recurrent dreams in which they frantically seek to hide the fetuses from others. Then we can kind of look at the legal realities. And the article wasn't quite accurate in how it characterized the treatment of post-viability abortions, fetuses under Roe v. Wade. It characterized the Supreme Court as reserving the right to protect the life of a viable fetus, without noting that in the companion decision, Doe versus Bolton, the mother's health was so broadly defined that all she had to do was have a reason for the abortion, and you'd be able to walk it through the loophole. They did note, however, that the court never directly acknowledged the chance of an aborted fetus being born alive, and it therefore never gave a clear guideline for dealing with what Dr. Thomas Carenier, a leading New York expert on abortions, has called the dreaded complication. 20 states have no laws limiting late abortions or mandating care for live-born abortion babies. And I have to hold, the abortion lobby is pretty firm about the fact that an abortion is a right to a dead baby. They insist that if a baby survives, it's only because it was targeted for abortion because it was moribund anyway. Oh, it was so sick from its prenatal condition that it was going to die anyway. So why they would object to treating it as you would any other baby in the same condition. But it's important that we look back to the fact that, you know, the Philly Inquirer was covering this decades ago, and we're having now, instead of trying to pretend it doesn't happen, they're trying to justify it on the grounds that they're just going to die anyway. Which, I mean, yeah, that baby lived 2.5 hours, that 2.5-pound baby, because she didn't get any care. Yeah, if you don't provide care, they're going to die anyway, aren't they? Then they look at some other babies. There was in March of 1981, doctors attempting what they thought was a 19 to 20 week abortion at Valley Abortion Clinic in Phoenix initiated an abortion only to have the mother deliver a 32-week infant weighing 2.5 pounds, and that baby was in intensive care for 2 months. An abortion at a Chicago facility, again an estimated 19 or 20 week pregnancy, resulted in the birth of a 2-pound baby boy. Then there's a case that pro-lifers of my generation know about because Dr. and Mrs. Wilkie included it in their book that I can't remember the title of now, but it was like it was Abortion 101 for people of my generation. A custodian at a hospital in Glasgow heard a cry from a paper bag left in the snow beside the incinerator. Opening the bag, he found a living infant of about 32 weeks gestational age. The baby's age prior to the abortion had been estimated at 26 weeks, and since it was supposed to be born dead, nobody bothered to check to see if it was alive before they put the baby in a paper bag and dumped him out in the snow. The baby was provided with care, but died 9 hours later, not surprising, with a preemie just left in a paper bag out in the snow, and nobody was ever charged in the death of this baby. And we have a baby in Bakersfield, California in 1973. Dr. Xavier Hall Ramirez initiated a saline abortion only to have the woman deliver a 4.5-pound infant. So nurses began to provide care for the baby, and they called Ramirez, who ordered them to discontinue oxygen. Another doctor countermanded the order, and the baby survived to be adopted. Ramirez was indicted for solicitation to commit murder. Other doctors testified in his defense, including Dr. Irvin Kushner of the University of California, Los Angeles. This doctor, who went on to become a top health policy official under President Carter, asserted that it was perfectly reasonable for him to expect a dead or moribund baby and to therefore just, whatever, let it die. There's another case where a woman said she was pregnant as a result of rape. However, it's kind of iffy about when she actually became pregnant. She'd been turned down at a Pittsburgh hospital because they estimated her pregnancy to be 26 to 31 weeks. So she went to West Penn Hospital, where Dr. Leonard Loft diagnosed her as only 20 to 22 weeks and charged ahead. The abortion, induced by an injection of prostaglandin, a substance that stimulates muscle contraction and delivery of the fetus, was filmed for use as an instructional film. The film showed the 3-pound infant moving and gasping. The baby wasn't provided with any care, and of course the baby died. During a coroner's inquest, Loft insisted that the baby had suffered fatal injuries during the abortion, so there'd been no point in providing any care, and no charges were ever filed. Then there was the Edelin case in Boston in 1973. Dr. Kenneth Edelin performed a hysterotomy abortion on a girl who was 24 weeks pregnant. Now, hysterotomy abortion is just a C-section with the intention of letting the baby die. That's the only difference between a hysterotomy and a C-section. It's exactly the same procedure, but a C-section, you treat the baby like a baby. A hysterotomy, you just wrap it in a towel, stick it in a closet, and wait for it to die. That's the only difference. Now, perhaps because they were in a hospital operating room instead of in a freestanding clinic where everybody was on board with the whole dead baby thing, Evelyn cut the mother's womb open, and then he pinched the umbilical cord and held the baby's head down in the amniotic fluid, likely in hopes of drowning the infant before delivering it. He was convicted of failing to provide an abortion survivor with care, resulting in death, but his conviction was overturned. And his diligence in ensuring that his teenage patient got the dead baby she paid for, it made him a darling of the abortion rights movement. If you Google Dr. Kenneth Edelin, everything you see on a pro-choice website is going to be how brave and stalwart he was, being willing to cut a woman open, a teenage girl, and kill her viable 24-week baby. Salute. Then there was baby girl W. That's the famous Waddle case where William Baxter Waddle strangled a 32-week abortion survivor in a hospital nursery in front of at least 2 horrified nurses, an emergency room physician, and a pediatrician. He beat the rap because nobody had done tests to determine the baby's brain function. So each time he was tried, there was at least one juror who said, well, you can't prove that he caused the death of the baby because death is cessation of brain function, and nobody tested this baby to verify that she had brain function. Then there was a baby boy in Los Angeles in July of 1979. A woman delivered an apparently dead baby after Dr. Boyd Cooper performed an abortion at 23 weeks at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The baby was taken to a utility room and left with the other aborted babies. Half an hour later, a nurse noticed that the 1 to 2 pound baby boy was gasping for breath. Cooper told the nurse, "Leave the baby there, it will die." The nurse's shift was over. She comes back to work 12 hours later. The baby is still alive. Cooper's like, okay, fine, take it to the intensive care unit. And the baby died 4 days later, and a coroner's jury ruled the death accidental. Cooper didn't do anything to try to help that baby die by leaving it in a utility room for 12 hours. So, the authors wrote, a common thread in all these incidents is that life was recognized and the episode brought to light by someone other than the doctor. Indeed, there is evidence that doctors tend to ignore all but the most obvious signs of life in an abortion baby. And I would call that a massive understatement. It took a lot of effort for Dr. William Waddle to extinguish the fairly obvious signs of life of baby W. Then we had the International Correspondence Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So in an issue published in 1974, a doctor wrote that he was troubled when an aborted infant survived and wasn't quite sure what to do. So they published in a subsequent issue some responses of other doctors. Dr. Ronald Bolognese of Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia said, "At the time of delivery, it has been our policy to wrap the fetus in a towel. The fetus is then moved to another room while our attention is turned to the care of the woman. She is examined and determined whether complete placental expulsion has occurred and the extent of vaginal bleeding. Once we are sure that her condition is stable, the fetus is evaluated. Almost invariably, all signs of life have ceased." Notice that this is also in keeping with what doctors in the Gosnell trial said you're supposed to do with the baby that comes out alive during an abortion. They expressed their shock and horror that Kermit Gosnell severed their spines with scissors. What you're supposed to do is wrap them in a towel and wait for them to die. Now, the Inquirer article, The Dreaded Complication, does note that Bolognese backtracked in a 1979 interview, saying that's not what we would do now. We would transport to the intensive care nursery. Dr. William Brenner of the University of North Carolina Medical School was a bit more charitable toward abortion survivors, at least if they continued to show signs of life after several minutes. He recommended calling the patient's doctor, the abortionist, who I might note has been paid to produce a dead baby, not a live one, and will be sued if a live one is resulting. Said if the baby remains tenacious of life after the abortionist has been consulted, the pediatrician on call should probably be apprised of the situation. Notice the total lack of urgency. It seems like the strategy is to just drag your feet long enough for the baby to gasp out his or her last breath. The Inquirer notes that in a 1979 interview, Dr. Warren Pierce, executive director of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, said that what a doctor should do if a baby survives an abortion is nothing. You assume the infant is dead unless it shows signs of life. You're dealing with a dead fetus unless there's sustained cardiac action or sustained respiration. It's not enough if there's a single heartbeat or an occasional gasp. And then the authors say, these seemingly callous policies are based on the assumption that abortion babies are too small or too damaged by the abortion process to survive and live meaningful lives. That is not necessarily the case, though, even for babies set aside and neglected in the minutes after delivery. Then we have Florida in the mid-1970s. The authors wrote, a nursing supervisor who asked not to be identified told of an abortion live birth in mid-70s in a Florida hospital. The infant was dumped in a bedpan without examination, as was standard practice. It did not die, the nurse said. It was left in the bedpan for an hour before signs of life were noticed. It weighed slightly over a pound. After several months in the neonatal intensive care unit, the baby survived and was adopted, and the nursing supervisor said that she continued to follow the child's progress and had photos of the child riding a bicycle and playing a little piano. Then we have 2 Wilmington babies in the spring of 1979. A nurse found an infant that had been placed in a plastic specimen jar after a saline abortion at Wilmington Medical Center. The baby was gasping for breath, so the nurse took the child to a nursery where it was provided with the same care as any other baby. The child survived and was later adopted. 5 weeks later, at the same hospital, a baby was clearly delivered alive after a saline abortion, and this one was immediately provided with care and did survive and was adopted. Then they had a baby girl at Inglewood Women's Hospital in February of 1979. This is the same hospital where Kathy Murphy, Lynette Wallace, Elizabeth Suji had already undergone fatal abortions, and after this event, Cora Lewis and Belinda Bird would suffer fatal injuries. So the baby was born alive. Somebody called Harbor General Hospital, associated with UCLA and fully equipped with a neonatal intensive care unit, but nobody from the neonatal unit came to pick up the baby. Though it was very unusual of them not to pick up an infant of this size, said Dr. Rosemary Leake of Harbor General, there had evidently been confusion about the baby's weight and vital signs. And the baby died after 3 hours. And then there was a baby in South Carolina in 1974. As Louise A. was 20 years old when her period stopped, she went to her hometown doctor's office where a nurse told her she wasn't pregnant. The nurse was mistaken, and this mistake delayed confirmation that Louise was indeed pregnant. She went to Dr. Jesse Floyd's office in July of 1974. Floyd determined that she was past the first trimester of pregnancy, and under South Carolina law, at the time, those later abortions had to be performed in a hospital. And it took Louise a while to pull together the $450 abortion fee. So Floyd admitted her to Richland Memorial Hospital, and on September 4th, injected her with prostaglandin to cause an abortion. And again, prostaglandin does not directly kill the baby. It causes such intense contractions that the baby typically dies basically of crushing injury. Sometimes the contractions are so strong that the cervix will rip off, or the baby will be decapitated by the force of these contractions. On September 6th, Louise said, I started having real bad labor pains again, and finally my baby was born. I called the nurse. Several nurses, including the head nurse, came into the room, Louise said, and the head nurse asked if she had known that the baby was a 7th-month baby. Louise said no. One of the nurses said the baby was alive. They took the baby out of the room. He never did cry. He just made some kind of a noise. The first doctor summoned to the abortion ward was a young resident who had been paid from the cafeteria. As the Inquirer said, she did not hesitate. On detecting a heartbeat of 100, she clamped and severed the umbilical cord and had the baby sent to the hospital's intensive care unit. It was a shock, a totally unique emergency situation, very upsetting to all of us, said the woman, who subsequently became a doctor in California. Some people have disagreed with me about ordering intensive care for an abortion, live birth, but it seems to me the only way to go. It's like watching a drowning. You act. You don't have the luxury of calling around and consulting. You institute life-preserving measures first and decide about viability later. At first, the baby's condition seemed to be improving. By the time he was 10 days old, they prognosed him as having a 50% chance of survival. Now, Louise, who never saw the baby, checked out of the hospital on September 8th. I kept calling this nurse, she said in a deposition. I would call and get information from them about the baby, and they told me he was doing fine. They told me he had picked up 2 or 3 pounds. I started going to school, and one afternoon I called them, and they told me the baby had died, but no one called me the cause of his death. The baby had developed a small tear in his intestines, and that and other complications resulted in his death on September 26, at just 20 days of age. Now, prosecutors there were faced with a very difficult case. Floyd himself never had any contact with the baby, nor was he involved in making decisions about the child's care. However, it struck the prosecutors as obvious that by proceeding with an abortion was illegal, and that it was done outside a hospital after the first trimester, and Floyd had taken action leading to the baby's death. He was charged with murder and criminal abortion. But eventually the abortion rights argument won over. Floyd could claim not knowing the baby was past viability, and could even assert under Roe and Doe that the state had no business meddling in his decision to perform an abortion even after viability, and the charges were dropped. Then in 1974, charges were filed against Dr. Herbert Schreiber of Camden, South Carolina, for first-degree murder and illegal abortion after allegations that a little girl had been born alive after an abortion and Schreiber had strangled her, pulled a waddle. Schreiber decided to plead not guilty to the crimes. A month after they were filed, he was found dead of suicide in a motel. The prosecutor said, basically, if he'd abided his time, he'd have been okay, given what happened with Jesse Floyd. And then there was a sidebar about hysterotomy abortions. As the infant is lifted from the womb, said one obstetrician, he is only sleeping like his mother. She is under anesthesia, and so is he. You want to know how they kill him? They put a towel over his face so he can't breathe, and by the time they get him to the lab, he is dead. Now, the doctor who said that said that he preferred saline abortions and screened his patients to make sure they weren't past 24 weeks. He did say they could be performed virtually all the way to birth. At 30 weeks, you would just draw off and inject that much more of the saline. Another doctor who wished to remain anonymous said, you can do it. Of D&E abortions past 24 weeks. Some son of a bitch misreads a sonogram and sends me a woman 26 weeks. I've done it. You've just got to take your time and be careful, and you're not going to end up with a live birth. Come back tomorrow for part 2 of the dreaded complication.